Hello. One of the big objections to Anglican Catholic worship is the idea that it is so formalised. Indeed, we have standards which some people don't like because we try to perfect our ritual. With the English Missal and with the Book of Common Prayer, we often find ourselves buried in ritual notes, trying to make sure that we get the right. And sometimes there are complaints about that. Isn't it better to be worshipping God freely? Why do we need ritual to worship? We can just say our prayers, extemporize, and the like. Of course, we're free to worship God in whatever way we want to, whatever way we feel called to. But there is a danger. St. Benedict says, he quotes, in much speaking, one cannot avoid sin. There's a truth in that. If we are speaking too much from ourselves, and we are trying to make our own prayers up, as it were, it's very, very easy for our own opinions to become the thing that we worship indirectly. It's not something we do consciously. We don't get out of bed and say, oh, well, today I'll worship my own opinion. That's not what we do, but we become entrenched with our own way of thinking. And surprisingly enough, having a prescribed ritual stops that from happening. Because the rite that we use has been crafted by the Church. It's most of us use the Gregorian rite, which is like the old Tridentine rite, but translated into English. Actually, it has its older roots in the Sarum rite, and of course the 1549 rite is incorporates bits of Sarum too. But the point is that this is where we worship together. If we say our own prayers, then we're always worshipping alone. And as I say, we can't always avoid falling into some trap or some heresy. And worshipping together stops that. Having a ritual allows us to worship together. But what about the fanciness? All the liturgical actions, the bowing and the scraping, as some people would say. One of the reasons I absolutely loathe the children's action song, the Hokey Cokey, is because it is based upon a Protestant polemic against the Catholic Mass. Hoc est corpus meum becomes Hokey Cokey. And it's that parody. And it's because people don't understand that the actions are there to mean something. The dress of the priest, likewise, it's there to mean something. It's not done just purely out of flummery or some form of catwalk modelling. That's not what's happening. And yes, you'll get Facebook groups that get a bit obsessed with the amount of lace on a particular priest's alb or the like. But the fact that we are using, in the Anglican Catholic Church, we're using old rites means that we are continuing the worship and continuing that same symbolism, that we are essentially trying to be a good mirror of heaven in the Mass. And it does matter to us, because we want to get it right, not out for ourselves, but for the worship of God, and to show other people who God is. But there is a danger, and I've just mentioned it and often pointed out. When people come up to us and accuse us of flummery, I think it's a good opportunity for us to look at ourselves and say, well, are we just being a bit fancy for the sake of being fancy? We've got to watch out for that. And the danger we fall into is very simple. Rather than the rules being a means to an end, we can start worshipping the rules. We can look at our liturgical rules, the way we do things, and they're there to promote good order, but that's the point. They are there to promote the good order of the Church. They're there to help people worship. And the same is true when people say, well, look, you're obeying some very archaic old canons. Well, the canons are there for a reason. They're not there to be exacted just for the sake of exacting them. They're there for a good purpose. One doesn't follow a rule just because it says so in the book. There's a reason for it. In law, it's not actually the written word that's important, it's the spirit of the law that gets answered first. And it's those people who worship the rule book, who are diminishing themselves, making themselves very small, and in some cases very bitter, that when they see a deviation from the rule book they get all shirty. And it damages their own worship. Now, it's not to say that we should be encouraging free-for-all. There's one thing that I can't stand. It's liturgical dancing in the Mass. In some cultures that might be the thing. In African cultures, indeed, that may be the way that they do things, because that's the African culture. It doesn't mean to say that we should appropriate that African culture into our Mass, particularly if that's not our heritage. That's doing the African culture a great disservice, as if it's just something fun to do. No. For those of African heritage, it is a vital piece of their heritage. It's a cultural expression of how they worship. Not something that we should take up here in the West. Same thing with guitars in worship. Yes, indeed, in the past there have been galleries of musicians playing the hymns, but everything was done and in order. The hymns were there to be sung, and people sang them. These days, if it's a guitar on stage, it's usually someone singing some very, very, have to be polite, emotional lyrics about our Lord, accompanied with some fancy guitar solos. And you can say to us, well, actually, isn't Alessandro Grandi doing something similar in the 17th century? With fancy organ work and coloratura singing. Well, that's a good point. Got to allow the Spirit to work, but often the guitar work is done on a stage and becomes the focus of attention. Grandi's work was done in galleries. So you heard, but you didn't see. It wasn't the focus of attention. Likewise with things like Couperin's organ masses. If you've ever heard Couperin, you have these wonderful organ pieces, solos, during the part of the Mass. It was there for the Mass, it was there to enhance the Mass. It was not a performance in its own right. So we've got to walk a good old Aristotelian mean between worshipping the rule book on one hand and free for all on the other hand. We've got to stop. We've got to walk that mean right in the middle. What we do has to have an end. We don't worship the rule book. We don't worship our desire to show off. That's the point. There's only one person who matters, and that is our Lord Jesus Christ, true God and true man. So I ought to rephrase that. That's one person. There are two others who matter, but one God. Wonderful, wonderfully complicated Trinitarian language becomes. Three persons, one God is what we worship. It's who we worship. And that's where our focus should be. Indeed, at that Mass, when the priest elevates that tiny little circle of host, nothing else in the universe matters. And that's how it should be. As if the whole universe were revolving around that site. Because that is Christ. And if our ritual obscures that, if our extempore, our personal outpourings of words obscure that, if the fancy vestments obscure that, if the rock guitars and loud organs obscure that, then there is a problem. One of the benefits of being a small church, the Anglican Catholic Church, is the fact that we are without huge trappings. We've got our wonderful little cathedral in Painters Forstal, but it's not too big to obscure what we do and what we believe. And that is the presence of our Lord Jesus Christ in the Mass, in the consecrated host. And that's what our rites are pointed to. Nothing less. So God bless you, and may you indeed find your worship completely Christ-focused. May you see him in your worship. May you feel his presence. And may you find that all that obstructs your seeing him taken away, that you may see him more clearly. God bless you, and please pray for me.